Spectacularly biased. We just elected our new chair. It's Art Rosenfeld. We were trying to find something we could give Tara that would make sense, and we had a lot of extremely tacky ideas. There's really nothing we can give you that could possibly represent our gratitude towards you. So what we've done is instead is just signed this. Everybody has signed this book, and with the inscription that Tara, you helped FAS through good times and bad, never running out of good ideas or good humor. You left us far better than you found us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to serve as the chair of this august and long-standing institution. I think arguably there's never been a time when the nation was more in need of accurate and foresightful science policy and technically informed debate. We were having one at our table as Joe was getting minute-by-minute updates on the latest publication of the National Intelligence Estimate on Iran. I'm not going to tell you the punchline. Maybe Matthew will if you don't have blackberries at your table. This award that it is my pleasure to bestow on Matt is named after a very distinguished scientist, as you know, who arguably made enormous contributions to physics and to science, but I think one could also argue that his greatest bestowal on the country was his public service and his uniting of science and public service. And hence this award is meant to honor someone who also does science in public view and for the benefit and for the better informed debates of science in the service of the government. So without further ado, let me turn you over to the guest of the hour, Matthew Bunn. Thank you.
Federation for this very humbling honor. When I think of Hans Bethe, and then I think of the previous recipients of this award, Philip Morrison and Steve Fetter, I really feel as though I'm walking in the steps of giants. And it's particularly humbling coming from an organization like the Federation of American Scientists that's played such a key role in reducing the dangers of nuclear weapons throughout the history of the nuclear age. What I want to talk about today is the need, I think, for really a new nuclear order to address the body blows that the nuclear non-proliferation regime has suffered in recent years and prepare it to cope with the challenges to come from a globalizing world where technology will be more and more available to more and more countries and people, and where nuclear energy may well expand and spread around the world. But first, I want to make the point that the global effort to stem the spread of nuclear weapons is, in fact, a lot more successful, and I would argue more resilient than most people seem to think. People have the idea that with North Korea pulling out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and making nuclear weapons, and Iran coming right up to the edge, and terrorists seeking nuclear weapons, and the AQCON network spreading sensitive technologies all over the globe, people have the idea that virtually anybody who wants a nuclear weapon can get one. And that's just not the case. If you look at the numbers, 20 years ago, there were 9 states with nuclear weapons. Today, there are 9 states with nuclear weapons. We've had no net increase in 20 years. North Korea added itself to the list, and South Africa dropped off. Not a very pleasant trade, I admit. But to have no net increase over a period that included the chaos following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Libya's secret nuclear weapons program, Iran's secret nuclear weapons program, Iraq's secret nuclear weapons program, the entire period of the AQCON network, and at the moment 7 years of an administration in Washington that's not been very committed to international treaties and bolstering the regime, is, I think, an amazing public policy success. There are now in the world today more states that started nuclear weapons programs and decided to give them up than there are states with nuclear weapons. That means that our efforts to stem the spread of nuclear weapons succeed more often than they fail. And I think we have an opportunity, if we work hard now, to extend that record into the future. The regime is now under enormous pressure. But the history also shows that the regime is quite resilient. And the reaction of the participants in this global effort to each one of the past crises has not been to walk away from the regime, but to try to strengthen it. And I hope that will be the reaction today, and I'm going to try to lay out some things that we could do. If you look at the 74 Indian test, the reaction in part was the creation of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. If you look at the revelation of the massive Iraqi nuclear weapons program that hadn't been detected by IAEA safeguards in 1991, the reaction was the creation of the additional protocol, which enormously strengthens the IAEA's ability to look for the undeclared nuclear activities. The reaction to fears of nuclear terrorism has been an increasingly effective international effort to lock down nuclear stockpiles around the world. Not as far as I would like to see it go yet, but increasingly effective over time. So it seems to me that the recent nonproliferation crises teach a number of pretty clear lessons about what we need to do to repair the regime and strengthen it for the future. And I want to walk through just a few of these lessons. First of all, and I think most importantly, engage the hard cases. The reality is today, the big nonproliferation issues are, let's face it, North Korea and Iran. If both of those go the wrong direction, the regime's in big trouble. If both of those go the right direction, even if we don't do any of the other things I talk about, the regime will be significantly better off. And we've seen in each of these cases the difference between what engaging can buy you and what isolating and sanctioning without any effort to engage buys you. So in the case of North Korea, in the Clinton years, we had a deeply flawed agreement that nonetheless froze North Korean plutonium production for 8 years and kept that spent fuel on those plutonium production reactors under international monitoring. We had the experience in this administration of a sanctions and speaking loudly approach with no engagement, and that led to the North Koreans pulling out of the NPT, reprocessing that plutonium, taking it Lord knows where, putting it into nuclear weapons, and setting off a nuclear bomb. And now we have a return to engagement, and we have once again a freeze, and now with, knock on wood, disablement of the plutonium production facilities in North Korea. Similarly, in Iran, by direct engagement with the Iranians, the Europeans managed to get a freeze for a couple of years on Iran's enrichment activities. But since the beginning of 2006, Iran has gone from just a handful of centrifuges in place to some 3,000 centrifuges in place, while we've been refusing to talk unless they suspend. So I think the conclusion is pretty clear. You've got to engage with the hard cases. Simply saying mean things about foreign countries and threatening to change their regimes doesn't buy you a whole lot. I'm actually very fond of Anthony Cordesman's description of the Bush administration's approach to North Korea, which he described as speak stickly and carry a big soft. Second, we have got to strengthen safeguards. Not only did we have the massive secret Iraqi nuclear weapons program for many years that went undetected, but in August of 2002, it was revealed that Iran had been carrying out a major nuclear program for 18 years in clear violation of its IAEA safeguards agreements without being detected by the IAEA, although frankly there are a number of things that the IAEA did know about that should have set off some alarm bells. We need an IAEA that is more attuned to the needs of today. It needs more budget, more personnel, more access to sites, more access to information, and it needs a reformed and more investigative safeguards culture within the agency. These are a lot of things that need doing, but they can be done, and some of them are beginning already. There has already been, I think, a very significant shift in the culture at the IAEA. On the access to information, I mean, it's remarkable what kinds of information the IAEA doesn't routinely get today. For example, if some state is shopping for technology to produce nuclear materials, and various states deny exports to that state of, say, centrifuge-related technology, they're not required to tell the IAEA about those export denials. That's just silly. That's very important information for the IAEA to have. It's my understanding that when Germany stopped thousands of aluminum tubes headed to North Korea, that the IAEA heard about it in the newspaper. That's just not the way things ought to be. All right. Third, the AQCON network teaches us that we need to drastically beef up interdiction of black market nuclear networks and everything else that we can do to stop black market nuclear networks. Here we had a network that was operating in more than 20 countries for decades before we finally took it down. Now, for a significant part of that period, we knew a lot, or at least some, about what it was doing, and were consciously choosing not to take it down in order to collect more information, in order to be able to get closer to the root and take it out root and branch. But nonetheless, it's clear, based on that experience, that we need to do a lot more in international police cooperation, intelligence cooperation, beefing up of export controls. It's a wide range of things that need to be done. And again, some are beginning to be done. One interesting thing that many people are unaware of is a small unit at the IAEA that is now specifically charged with tracking black market nuclear networks. And one of the things they're doing, turns out very often companies that have these kinds of technologies get requests that don't even make it to the level where they decide to file an export application because it's so obviously not something that's going to be approved. And those things traditionally have just gone in the trash can. So this group has gone to these various companies and said, you know, don't throw that in the trash can, give it to us. And so they're developing a much better idea of who it is that's still out there shopping and the various front companies that exist and so on. Don't believe that the statement that, you know, the AQCON network is taken down and is no longer operating. There are chunks of that network that are still operating and other networks evolving. Fourth, we need to toughen enforcement. After the first North Korean crisis, when it was clear they had violated their safeguards agreement in the mid-90s, the Security Council did a whole lot of nothing for years and years and years. It wasn't until the North Koreans provoked them by testing a nuclear bomb that they finally got around to imposing some sanctions, and they were relatively modest sanctions given the stakes. I think there's an enormous amount that we need to do to strengthen enforcement. It's tough because of the differing views of the countries on the Security Council and the difficulty of generating unity and political will on the Security Council. But one, I think, very useful proposal that Pierre Goldschmidt and others have made is the notion of passing a country-neutral resolution now that lays out a series of penalties that the Security Council would impose for countries that violated their NPT commitments and their IAEA safeguards agreements, including forcing them to accept a much broader array of inspections, even than those required by the additional protocol. Fifth, we need to do more to limit the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technology. Now, this is a hard problem, and we have to be careful to do no harm in our efforts in this direction. Since President Bush's 2004 speech saying we're going to stop the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technology, we've seen the greatest explosion of interest in enrichment in the nuclear age, with a wide variety of countries suddenly saying, gee, if there's going to be a line drawn between the haves and the have-nots, I want to get myself onto the have side of that line before it gets drawn. But I think there is a lot that can be done. These efforts toward international fuel banks, I think, have some value, although on the front end, since unless you're a special case like Iran or India, you already have reliable access to fuel through the commercial market anyway. I think the fuel banks are perhaps, they're important, but I think not going to be as much of a panacea as they are sometimes made to seem. I think at the same time they can be the institutional framework that we can then use to move toward the back end. If we can someday reach a state where we can promise states that we will take away their spent fuel, that will be an enormous incentive for states to rely on international fuel supply rather than building their own facilities, because then they could avoid having a repository of their own. 6, my main subject, we need to strengthen security for nuclear stockpiles around the world. That's the lesson of the persistent efforts of al-Qaeda to get nuclear weapons, and of Aum Shinrikyo before them. And there's a lot that's been done, but there's an enormous amount that remains still to be done. Just a couple of weeks ago, 4 gunmen penetrated the security at a South African nuclear site at Pelindaba. They managed to overcome the detection system at the perimeter at the site, possibly with inside information from the site. They were on site for 45 minutes without being engaged by the security forces at the site. In fact, no alarm went off when they penetrated the security perimeter. The alarm only went off after they had shot an officer in the control room at the site, and that officer then rang the alarm. Fortunately, he, while shot in the chest, was still able to ring the alarm. So there's a lot to do, and this is not just a Russia problem, this is a global problem, and I think the South Africa situation and the Pakistan situation that's now unfolding make that very clear. 7th, and perhaps most important, we need to do more to reduce the demand for nuclear weapons. Everything else that I'm talking about, in a sense, only delays, only makes it more difficult, more expensive. A state that was really determined to get nuclear weapons over time would find ways over these various other barriers. So we have to reduce demand, and that has been surprisingly successful over the years. As I say, there are now more states that started nuclear weapons programs and decided to give them up than there are states with nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, I think that the doctrine that we reserve the right to launch preventive wars has a tendency to increase rather than decrease demand for nuclear weapons. I think our threats of regime change against both Iran and North Korea have strengthened the arguments of those in those capitals who are arguing for nuclear weapons. I also think that the India deal, whatever its other merits or flaws, changes the incentives some, because it makes clear that, or at least it strengthens the arguments of those in various capitals who say, oh, well, they'll be upset if we go for nuclear weapons for a little while, but then after that they'll come crawling back and be friends with us. I am told by Iranian colleagues that that is precisely the argument being made in Tehran. You know, look what happened when India tested in 1998. Everybody sanctioned them for 6 months, and then pretty soon the Americans were crawling back, and look, now they're negotiating a civil nuclear cooperation agreement with them. Finally, almost all of these steps involve more constraints and inconveniences for the non-nuclear weapon states. If we want to have any hope of getting the votes that we need in various international fora to get tougher export controls, stronger safeguards, better enforcement, we need to be seen to be holding up our end of the bargain. In the 2000 NPT review, as most of you know, we agreed to 13 steps toward nuclear disarmament. As far as I can determine, looking over those 13 steps, there's only one of them that remains supported by the Bush administration. And in the 2005 review, the Bush administration absolutely refused to even discuss those 13 steps. In the 2005 Millennium Summit, they refused to even let the word disarmament be used, despite its appearance in our legally binding obligation in Article 6 of the NPT. Fortunately, there's a long list of steps that would strengthen our security on their own, that would also contribute to changing the political dynamic in the nonproliferation regime and building the kind of political support we're going to need for achieving these kinds of objectives and strengthening the regime, ranging from much deeper nuclear reductions, more progress toward international verification, ratification of the comprehensive test ban, and more. I think the initiative launched by Secretaries Kissinger, Schultz, Perry, and Senator Nunn is particularly promising because it brings heavy hitters from both sides of the national security debate in the United States behind a sort of comprehensive agenda toward nuclear reductions, nonproliferation, and ultimately the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So what all this means in my mind is that we really do need a new nuclear order in which the number of nuclear weapons is greatly reduced and declining. The role of nuclear weapons is limited only to deterring nuclear attacks by others. The nuclear fuse is greatly lengthened by putting all of our nuclear weapons in a state where it would take many hours or perhaps days to launch them, and ultimately building a global norm that it is simply too dangerous to have nuclear weapons in any other state of readiness. A norm with a much greater intensity of international inspection, a much greater breadth of international control over nuclear activities, where security of global stockpiles are greatly increased, where the contribution from civilian nuclear energy is increased, but along with that, where international control of that enterprise is increased and restraints on the spread of sensitive technologies are greatly strengthened. If we take effective action now and in building towards such a new nuclear order, I think there's at least a hope that 20 years from now we will still have only 9 states with nuclear weapons and maybe fewer. And that we can put ourselves on a path to greatly reduce nuclear dangers and ultimately to the prohibition of nuclear weapons. It's a demanding agenda, but I really think the risks to our security posed by the existing nuclear regime demand no less. So with that, I will stop.
He's put himself as a target of opportunity here. So, yeah, Lee.
If we have a Democrat in the White House that's coming louder than people at the back, absolutely. If we have a Democrat in the White House, are we likely to be able to regain some of the ground we've lost under Bush?
Well, there's an explicitly partisan question. It is my hope that would be true. On the other hand, it is also historically true that Democrats feel more constrained in how far they can go. So it was, after all, a Republican, Ronald Reagan, who was discussing abolishing all nuclear weapons at Reykjavik with Gorbachev 20 years ago. But I am actually at least modestly hopeful that there are, at least on certain aspects of this agenda, on strengthening inspections, on improving nuclear security to prevent nuclear terrorism, that there are people on both sides of the aisle who are strongly committed to that. So I await the outcome, but I'm hopeful that we will be able to undo some of what I see as the damage of the last 7 years. On the other hand, I should say, in all fairness, that there are quite a few major steps on nonproliferation that have been promoted by the Bush administration, in some cases more successfully than my colleagues and I managed to do in the Clinton years. There's clearly more being done today to secure nuclear stockpiles than there was when President Bush took office. There's just no doubt about that. There's more money being spent, there's more sites getting secured, there's more different approaches being taken, there's more different countries where that cooperation is going forward. Similarly, I think that, for better or for worse, I tried to convince folks in the Clinton years to support boosting the budget of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and I got a whole lot of nowhere. And the Bush administration not only supported that, but managed to convince the other countries on the Board of Governors who were pretty reluctant to push it through. And so we got the first real increase in the IAEA budget in a long, long time. And they've launched a number of worthwhile initiatives, in the Proliferation Security Initiative, the Global Threat Reduction Initiative, the new global initiative to combat nuclear terrorism. So there's, I would say, there are things that I have very serious problems with in the Bush administration's non-proliferation policy, but it ain't all bad. Yeah, David.
If we assume for a minute that Senator Clinton becomes president, out of your long agenda list, what are the couple things that you think the people in this room should be pushing for the first 6 months of a new administration?
Ooh, first 6 months. That's always a tough question. Well, I think we may be, to some extent, driven by the schedule. In particular, START will be expiring at the end of 2009, and somebody is going to have to do something about that unless the Bush administration manages to get some verification measures negotiated before they leave office. I would hope that that will be true, but I don't frankly expect that that will be true. Secondly, we'll have the 2010 NPT review coming up. But perhaps more important than either of those, if I had to guess, both Iran and North Korea will still be major problems that will be on the front of the agenda. So I think probably the top priority is going to have to be figuring out how we're going to engage with Iran and North Korea. On the other hand, I am always of the view that securing nuclear stockpiles has to be very close to the top of the agenda, because the reality is if another state gets nuclear weapons, it will be a problem, but deterrence will continue to operate. We will be able to ensure our security. If a terrorist gets nuclear weapons, it's a whole other ballgame. And while the probability is less, the consequences are just so enormously high that we have to keep our eye on the ball of preventing nuclear terrorism at the same time. Mark.
How important is it, as you said, to have this goal of eliminating nuclear weapons entirely, explicitly in policy, or is just being on the right track good enough to satisfy people in the near term? I ask that because there's still a lot of people who think, no way in hell are we ever going to go to zero.
Right. Well, I think Sam Nunn actually had the best metaphor for this that I've heard anyway. He said, you know, zero nuclear weapons is the top of a very tall mountain. And from where we are on the mountain, we can't see the top. And we can't see whether there's a pathway that's going to ever lead us to the top. But we know we have to be heading toward the top, and maybe as we get closer to the base camp, we'll be able to see a pathway that leads to the top. And right now, in his judgment, he feels we're heading down. I'd feel we're heading sort of around the periphery of the mountain. But in any case, we need to be heading up, and we need to be heading up at a faster rate than we are at the moment. So I think there is a legitimate debate as to whether making the ultimate goal of zero explicit, how important that is. I personally am convinced that it is important, along with those 4 who signed on to the Wall Street Journal article. But I know many people who argue that it's a distraction, because there's many people who would be happy to sign on to all of the steps along the way that need to be done right now, but are nervous about signing on to the notion of that the eventual goal is zero. Norm.
Hi. Are there any more comments you'd make on Iran, other than predicting it'll still be a problem for us down the road?
Well, I just gave a big talk on that subject, which is available on our website, managingatom.org. And the argument I made was the following, and it's a controversial one even among my good friends in the non-proliferation community. I would guess that, for example, Joe Strinzioni probably doesn't agree with it.
Say it and I'll disagree.
And many of the people at my center don't either. So the argument in a nutshell was we essentially, I was trying to assess the different options, and I argued that if we continue to insist on zero centrifuges as the only acceptable long-term outcome in Iran, that all of the various things I could think of in the way of combinations of more sanctions and more positive incentives and so on all led to a low probability of success, and therefore a high probability of no agreement, which would mean either an unconstrained Iranian program or military strikes, both of which I argued were very high risks to U.S. national security. And therefore, I argued the time has come to start thinking hard about what the least bad of the options other than zero centrifuges in Iran are going to be. Partly because ultimately, if there's going to be a deal, somebody's going to have to walk into Ayatollah Khamenei's office and convince him that it serves Iran's interests. I just don't see him saying yes to abandoning every single one of the centrifuges in Iran. I think within the dynamics of their internal debate, which is like our internal debate, everybody's competing to be, you know, more nationalist than the other one, being the one who's advocating to the Ayatollah, you know, we should give up on the enrichment program entirely, I don't think is going to be a winner in that internal debate. And we have to give, if we want to negotiate a deal, we have to give the advocates of compromise within Tehran something they can work with that they could plausibly sell to Khamenei. So I argued that a situation with a small number of these 164 cascades, maybe 2, maybe 4, something like that, that were entirely internationally owned, internationally staffed, all of the R&D and manufacturing also internationally owned and internationally staffed, would be the least bad of a bad set of options right now. On the other hand, I really don't see it heading that direction. I don't see that being acceptable to the current government in Washington or in London or Paris, for that matter. I don't see any interest in the current Iranian government in actually negotiating at the moment. This most recent interaction between Vaidi and Solana was actually a bit of a surprise to me, because I thought they had decided to be clever enough to keep stringing us along and making it seem as though there was some progress. And for them to just come in and say, forget it, you know, everything you talked about before is over, I thought was a mistake on their part, because I think it increases the probability that the advocates of military strikes will win the argument. I don't think that's a high probability, but I think it's you know, enough that I worry about it a good bit, that we may have military strikes as the outcome of this. And I don't think that would stop the Iranian program. I think it would turn the Iranian program from a program about buying an option to a program that's going straight for the bomb, as the Israeli strike on Osirak did in Iraq in 1981. And I think the other consequences in terms of what Iran can do in terms of international reaction and so on just create immense risks to our national security. I think it would be a huge mistake to go that direction. Sorry for such a long answer. Joe?
No, I actually agree with that position. I think that the possibility of getting zero centrifuges spinning is gone. Maybe we could have got that a year ago. We certainly could have gotten it in 2003, but that's gone. And what we're looking for is some sort of ledge we can stabilize at. And the goal should be to contain the program now in exchange for greater transparency. This is
right.
What
and greater international control.
If we're going to compromise on how many centrifuges,
right.
What are we looking for?
Right.
So
well, that's why I talked about, well, additional protocol plus, plus meaning the ability to, for example, interview participants and so on. But I think this international staff at all of the relevant centrifuge-related facilities. And by the way, I spoke about the centrifuges, but I see my friend Jeffrey in the back, who's always reminding people that there's also a plutonium program in addition to a uranium program. But I think the notion of an international staff gives you much more day in, day out transparency into what's going on in the program, number one. Number two, I think it helps you at least a little on the covert facility problem, because most countries, including countries like Iran, don't have enough, serious centrifuge people to have two independent sets. And so if you're working with these guys day in, day out, and they start disappearing for a week or two at a time, that gives you an additional indicator that there's something covert that's going on. It's by no means perfect. What we would like to have, we, the United States, would like to have, is a broad and verifiable gap between what the Iranians are allowed to do and nuclear weapons. And they have been, by installing these centrifuges, narrowing that gap. And I'm saying this is about as much of that gap as I can see we could plausibly get in the near term. Yeah.
How do you read the signals or signs coming from Russia? And in your experience, what do people in Russia think about what it means? And also long term, of course, what is Russia looking for in its nuclear relationship, for example, with the United States?
A broad question. First of all, the good news. The good news is that partly because of Bush's action in taking the nuclear security issue to the summit in Bratislava in February of 2005, which was not unrelated to efforts by some of the people in this room, shall we say, that the agenda of locking down and improving security for nuclear stockpiles has been going forward despite the downturn in U.S.-Russian political relations, and seems to have Putin's imprimatur, and has been, accelerated and expanded. We have the leader of that program, Dave Huizenga, is among those in the audience and can disagree with me if he chooses, but I doubt if he will. However, on the broader front, Russia is a nation feeling its oats. There's no doubt about it, and they have gotten much tougher in a lot of discussions, not only on nuclear issues but on other issues. I think there is still an opportunity, because Russia wants it, to get a follow-on arms reductions treaty that greatly reduces strategic nuclear weapons and that revives some of the verification measures that will otherwise expire with START at the end of 2009. I don't think there's much opportunity for the moment to do a whole lot on tactical nuclear weapons. I wish I thought there were. I think things are going in the wrong direction on tactical nuclear weapons in the Russian space, and in fact the Russians are I think it's now very likely that they're going to pull out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and possibly begin actually manufacturing some tactical nuclear missiles. So, I think we need to push hard to get things done with them where we can, and push hard to try to figure out ways to change the politics back to a more favorable space where we can't at the moment. Tom in the back.
Matt, when you argue we should constrain the Iranian program to a certain number of centrifuges, I think you'd better serve to constrain the number of SWUs, given that Urenco's centrifuges are 30 times more efficient, and USEC centrifuges are 150 times more efficient.
Yeah, I have reasonable confidence Iranians aren't going to master the Urenco or the USEC technology anytime soon. But you're right, absolutely. It should be. I would actually argue for constraints on both, on number of centrifuges and, in case they somehow mastered really good centrifuges, number of total SWUs that could be produced. Yeah, way in the back there.
The recent Israeli strike against Syria. Anything you can tell us about that?
I wish I knew more about what had happened there. My friend Jeffrey, who's in the back, coined the wonderful phrase, the box on the Euphrates, to describe the object that was bombed. There are various people who know a lot about it, who seem convinced that that was a reactor. And maybe they have information from inside the U.S. government that I don't have. But the satellite pictures don't convince me of that. I mean, it was a very big box. That's clear. It didn't have a stack. If that object down by the river was a pumping station, it was a pumping station that was a long way from that reactor. And I don't know of any other reactor that has a pumping station a long, long, long way away from the reactor. So it remains a little bit of a mystery. One report that I've heard is that it might have been a facility for mating chemical warheads to missiles, which would explain why the Syrians were so eager to raise it to the ground and avoid having anybody come inspect it after the Israeli attack. So one obvious question is what Israel thought it was and what they thought they were doing. The chemical weapons theory would be one plausible thing. But the nuclear theory is certainly held by a large number of people who are well connected in Israel. I think it also partly was sending a message to the Iranians that there's a line, and we're not going to tell you exactly where it is, but at a certain point, if you go too far, this could happen to you. Now, the Israelis are very aware that, unlike the Syrian case where the Syrians didn't respond at all, the Israelis definitely expect that if they launch military strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities, that there will be a major Iranian retaliation that they will have to confront. And that would be my guess also if we launched military strikes against Iran's facilities. But so I don't have any good information about the box on the Euphrates is the bottom line. John Isaacs in the back there.
Achieving a comprehensive test ban treaty in the next administration will take a major, awful lot of work and require, of course, substantial bipartisan support. Some people think that, especially if it's a Democratic administration, they really can undertake only one of those arms control efforts per 4 years. Do you think the test ban treaty is one of the things that should be pursued very promptly in the new administration, if it's sympathetic, or that this other list of items that you have should be pursued instead? Or can we do both?
I think we should recommit ourselves to a comprehensive test ban at the very beginning of the next administration. And I think we should begin work to build support for ultimate ratification of the comprehensive test ban. But if the administration was concluding that, there's only one thing that I can really push through the Senate in my first term, I'm not sure I would make the CTB that one thing. For one thing, it may take longer than one term to build enough support. I don't know if all of you saw the recent letter that Kyle ginned up, where he, it was just a few weeks ago, where he managed to get 40 senators, which of course is enough to stop a treaty, to sign a completely ridiculous letter making a variety of completely false assertions about how much a CTB would undermine our security and was completely unverifiable, and et cetera. So we got a lot of work to do, given that he just managed to get a bunch of people on the record, some of whom are going to have to get them to switch their votes unless the Senate changes a lot in 2008. So it may take longer than one term to... The one thing we should not do, again, is go to a vote when we don't have the votes.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We have to... So this is the 2007 Hans Bethe Award presented to Matthew Bunn for science and service to a more secure world. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I forgot to mention I have copies of this here, Securing the Bomb, if anybody wants them.
Okay. Right.
I'll take one.
Okay. And for FAS board members, we begin at 2 o'clock back in the FAS building.
Unsigned copy.